I want to give you this scenario that may have happened to you at some point in your life playing fantasy football. You're hanging out with your buddies and you're doing your draft. You really want a player because you like him a lot and he's on your favorite team. For the sake of simplicity, let's just call this man Robbie Receiver. You're only 2 picks away from potentially getting Robbie Receiver. He's not necessarily near the top of any big boards, so it's pretty likely that barring a complete surprise, you're going to get him. Your friend comes up and announces that he's taking Willie Whiteout. However, because your buddy just got off of work and isn't chronically online, your buddy had no idea that earlier in the day, Willie Whiteout was ruled out for the season with a torn ACL. You decide to be a good Samaritan and let your friend know, hey, the guy you drafted isn't going to play this year. He got injured. Your friend thanks you for being a good friend and thanks you for letting him know. He gets a chance to do over his pick as a result. And sure enough, with the redo pick, he takes none other than Robbie Receiver, who winds up being the top receiver in the NFL in that season and ends up being a big reason why he won the championship, as he puts up 07 Randy Moss numbers on the season. You'll be thinking to yourself after that, wait a second, time out. You're telling me that I was the nice guy, and for being a good friend, I just got screwed over? I would have had the best receiver in the game if I just kept my mouth shut and didn't try to be a good friend? Having something like that happen to you must absolutely suck. No two ways around it. Well, I bring that up because this man right here is linebacker Joe Schmidt. And at the 1953 NFL Draft, the Steelers would have been able to take him if they just kept their mouth shut. Seriously. If you think of all the great players in Steelers history and all the great defenders that they've had over the years, from Jack Ham to Joe Green to Jack Lambert to Troy Polamalu to Rod Woodson to a whole bunch of guys in between, they were this close to having another player who was, without a doubt, one of the greatest of all time at his position. And if you've ever heard the phrase that nice guys finish last, well, that happened at the NFL Draft nearly 75 years ago in a story that deserves a deep dive all these years later. Because this is the story behind Joe Schmidt and how the Pittsburgh Steelers let a Hall of Fame linebacker get away from them at the 1953 NFL Draft. Make sure you hit that like button down below, subscribe, hype up that video, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single video that we post on the channel. Because we post every single day on here about the weird and the wacky history of the NFL with stories like this one that you may not have heard of before. So if you like that sort of stuff, then this is definitely the place for you. Thanks in advance for liking and subscribing, and for hyping up the video, and for helping us grow this community. And with that in mind, let's talk about the time that the Steelers could have drafted Joe Schmidt, and then had an "Oh Schmidt" moment. But before I get to exactly what happened, we need some context to understand how the NFL Draft worked back in 1953, as well as how scouting worked back in 1953, because it was a completely different process than what we know of today. While there are a ton of differences, there are 2 main differences between the draft in the 50s and the draft today when it pertains to this video, and we'll get to the second one in just a little bit. But the first one is that teams did not have extensive scouting departments. Today, you can basically analyze and scout everyone by acquiring tape from every school and by putting in a ton of data points. And these teams have the money to hire scouting departments to do just that. Back in 1953, scouting was extremely limited, not just in terms of your budget and how many scouts you had and how much tape you watched on a prospect, but where your scouts went. This meant that with the draft being a whopping 30 rounds back then, and teams having to make 30 picks if they kept all of them, once we got past the big players that everyone knew, many teams would just choose guys from local schools that they at least knew of. At the 1952 NFL Draft the year before, for instance, the Cleveland Browns drafted 4 players out of Ohio State, and the Chicago Cardinals drafted 3 players out of Purdue just 2 hours up the road. By the later rounds in the draft, many of these teams were just throwing darts at the board and hoping something stuck, having never even seen the player in question and relying on a school media guide that may or may not have been accurate. So any local player who they may have seen play had an advantage, to say the least. And for the Pittsburgh Steelers, there was one guy that they really liked out of Pitt, with that guy being linebacker Joe Schmidt. Schmidt was a darn good linebacker for the Panthers and was a big reason why Pitt had a top 15 ranking at one point for the first time since 1939. In 1952, as the team's captain, he was named a first-team All-American at linebacker, becoming the first linebacker in school history to ever win this award, and was so good that eventually he got inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame and got his number retired by the school. Schmidt didn't necessarily have the greatest frame in the world, as he only weighed a hair over 200 pounds by the time he was done playing at Pitt, but he was a great tackler who knew where the ball was going to be. In fact, he was so good that the sons of Steelers owner Art Rooney, alongside Ed Keeley, the publicity director for the Steelers, were begging head coach Walt Kiesling to take him and to keep the hometown kid in the Steel City. Keep a darn good linebacker in town who was born in Pittsburgh, went to high school in Pittsburgh, and went to college in Pittsburgh. Not only could he be a great player, but he'd be a great story and could be used to sell tickets, which was a legitimate consideration back in 1953 due to how different the landscape of the league was and how teams made revenue. Kiesling still wasn't entirely sold on Schmidt due to his small frame, but the Steelers decided that if Schmidt was on the board when the 8th round came along, that they'd do it and pull the trigger and take Schmidt. Across their first 7 picks, they hadn't taken a player yet from within the state. And while they already took a linebacker early in the draft with their 3rd round pick, it couldn't hurt them to take another one, especially with one of their linebackers, Frank Sinkovitz, having his career end after the 1952 campaign. Schmidt was going to be the pick if he was still on the board, and all that had to happen was for the Detroit Lions, the defending NFL champion, to not take him at the end of round 7. And sure enough, the Lions did not take him. Crisis averted. They chose a completely different player. Who that player was, I have no idea. But the Lions did not spend their 7th round pick on Joe Schmidt. And if the Steelers brass just kept their mouths shut and didn't say anything and let the Lions go on about their day, then that'd be the end of the story. Schmidt would be taken by the Steelers near the top of the 8th round, and Schmidt would be staying in town. However, I said earlier that there were 2 major differences that needed to be talked about when it comes to the NFL draft back in 1953 and the NFL draft today. The second difference? No one really knew what the heck they were doing. Today, it's very easy to know which players are eligible and which players are not. Any team at the 2026 NFL draft knows that they can take Fernando Mendoza, but they cannot take Arch Manning. Any team at the 2026 NFL draft knows that they can take Jordan Tyson, but they cannot take Jeremiah Smith. But back in 1953, especially with technology and how news traveled, and especially with pro sports not being the multi-billion-dollar industry that it is today, sometimes teams were just guessing on who was eligible and who wasn't. And being eligible wasn't enough. You also might not know until after you drafted a player that they weren't even going to play for you, either because they already announced that they're working a job outside of football, or because they've been signed to play up north in the rival Canadian Football League. To give you an idea of how different the draft was, imagine if Roger Goodell came up to the podium before every draft and said anything like what Commissioner Bert Bell started off every draft by saying. As Bert always said before each draft, we're all in this thing together, fellows. So if you know of any player who already is signed in Canada, or whose class hasn't graduated yet, or who isn't eligible to be drafted for any other reason, I want you to speak up. Let's give each other a hand here and save our fighting for on the field. Seriously, each team was supposed to help each other out to some extent during the draft. And if one general manager was being stupid or clueless and was wasting his picks, instead of taking advantage of him, you were supposed to lend him a hand. Again, this made sense back in the landscape of 1953, but it's hysterical to look back on nowadays. So, how does this relate to the Steelers? Well, when the Lions made that 7th round pick, as it turns out, the player that the Lions drafted was ineligible. I'm not sure if he had already signed a contract in Canada or just wasn't eligible to come out of college yet, but whatever the case, the Lions drafted a player that could not be drafted. And someone on the Steelers, being an honorable person and steward of the league, got up after the Lions made their pick and said, "Detroit? Yeah, the guy you just drafted, he's not eligible." Lions head coach Buddy Parker thanked the Steelers brass for saving his butt from drafting an ineligible player, and thanked Pittsburgh for pointing that out and for being honest. Parker canceled the pick and got to redo it, all because the Steelers told the Lions that their pick was illegal. And with their second chance at a 7th round pick, the Lions, who could have taken anyone else on the board, as you might have been able to guess, took the man that you've been watching this entire time. That's right, they picked linebacker Joe Schmidt. And yeah, the rest is history. Schmidt started 151 games for Detroit across 13 seasons and was named a Pro Bowler in 10 consecutive years from 1954 to 1963, being named an AP First Team All-Pro linebacker 8 times, finishing inside the top 5 of the MVP voting multiple times, which is insane for a linebacker, and not only being named to the All-1950s team, but being named to the NFL's 100th anniversary team. For some perspective on how good he was, by 1963, Schmidt was tied with legendary 49ers defensive lineman Leo Nomalini for the most Pro Bowl appearances in NFL history, making it there 10 times. And as for his 8 AP First Team All-Pro appearances, to this day, that is the literal record for most All-Pro appearances by a defender, tied with Reggie White, Bill George, Lawrence Taylor, Bruce Smith, and Aaron Donald for the honor, as in guys who are the greatest defenders of all time. He's in the Hall of Fame, for what it's worth. No surprises there. And if we exclude AFL All-Star appearances, only 2 players in NFL history have more AP First Team All-Pros than Schmidt has, with those guys being Jerry Rice and Anthony Munoz. As for the next man the Steelers drafted with Schmidt off the board, they drafted wide receiver Lowell Perry, who ended his career with 14 catches. So yeah, I think the Steelers would like to have that one back. On one hand, I can't blame the Steelers for trying to do the right thing and for being honorable. In a world full of people breaking the rules and trying to cheat, I have to admire an organization that instilled values in its members to try and make sure everyone did the right thing and to keep everyone honest. Some people have a chance to be the banker in Monopoly and cheat and give themselves secret money. The Steelers, if anything, are the banker that underpays themselves every time they pass go. It's Ned Flanders on steroids. On the other hand, when you let arguably the best linebacker in NFL history go, and it wouldn't have happened if you just kept your mouth shut and let the defending champions of the league screw up, and trying to play the nice guy ends up backfiring that badly, yeah, it's gonna look like you would egg on your face. When life gives you lemons, make lemonade. And on draft day in 1953, thanks to the help of the Steelers, the Lions turned a heaping pile of Schmidt into Joe Schmidt. Check out our live streaming schedule for the next few days. We're live every single day on this channel, whether we're covering a sporting event or playing GeoGuessr or just taking your requests. So make sure you like and subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single time that we go live and so that you can join this community. Also, thanks to all our members and our Patreon supporters who get exclusive perks like their name of the end of each video, members-only Q&A streams, and cool emojis to use on videos and during streams. See how you can join this community and become a member or a Patreon member by clicking the link in the description below.